Hello everyone and welcome. It's a pleasure to meet you all here today. My name is Leila Moslemi, PhD candidate at the Department of Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations. I want to take a moment to recognize and acknowledge some individuals here today. I would like to extend my deepest gratitude to Dr. Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali, whose support of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies has made this program possible. I want to also thank to our mentor, Professor Mohammad Tawakkoli Targhi, the inaugural director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies, for supporting the Iranian Studies Students Forum. My sincere thanks also goes to Bilal Hashmi, the administrative coordinator of the Institute, for his continuous support and for organizing the event. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, this land has been the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississauga of the Credit. Today, it continues to be the home of many indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We are deeply grateful for the opportunity to gather and work on this land. Now, I would like to introduce our moderator for the first panel. My dear colleague, Hanieh Bakhtiari, a PhD student at the Department of Near and Middle Eastern Civilization, served as the coordinator of Women Poets Iranica at the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies and as the communication officer of the Iranian Studies Student Forum. She will be moderating the first panel. For the second panel, my dear colleague, Dr. Nilufar Houman, from the Department of Communication Studies and Media Art at McMaster University, who has been a constant and rigorous collaborator and supporter of the students during the formation of this event, will moderate the second panel. At the end, I just wanted to mention a few changes happened in the panel. Paria Rahimi has moved to the second panel, and unfortunately, Matheus Burgess will not be attending today. Each presentation will be 15 minutes. My colleague Gun Hakim will notify the presenters when there are 5 and 1 minutes remaining. The Q&A sessions will take place at the end of each panel and will last 15 minutes. Before we get started, Dr. Professor Tawakkoli, would you like to share a few words with us?
I would like to thank the Iranian Studies Student Forum for organizing this interesting gathering. And thank you for your inspirational presidency of the society, the forum. And I also want to extend my gratitude to all of you who are participating and presenting. Enjoy.
Thank you. So now the first moderator, dear Hanieh Bakhtiari, is going to open up the first panel.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Hanieh Bakhtiari, and it's an honor and a pleasure to see you all here today. Thank you so much for showing up for our graduate student symposium, which is today titled Embodied Voices, Revolutionary Narratives. And before anything, let me thank Leila Moslemi, who passionately organized this symposium with the help of Dr. Nilufar Houman from McMaster University. Thank you, Leila Jan. Thank you, Nilufar Jan. And I'll be chairing our first session today, and our first panel is called Gender, Art, and Literature in Persian Modernity. And we will be hosting 4 presenters. So our first presenter is Sara Molaie, friend. So Sara Jan is also a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, the Department of Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations. She studies the history of modern Iran and specifically targets the intersection of gender modernization and literary modernity. Using archival materials and feminist methodologies, she evaluates the relationship between gender, literature, and public culture in modern Middle East. Sara Jan, we're here to listen to your interesting presentation.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Hello everyone again. I also would like to thank Elahé Omidyar, Institute of Iranian Studies, Dr. Tabakali, and our colleague Leila Moslemi for organizing such an event. Is my voice clear? Today I'm talking about Zandukht Shirazi, and I will share a few samples of her writing published in the press. And just to clarify that Zandukht Shirazi is one of the figures, not the only figure, is one of the figures whose writing display gender and literary modernity in modern Persian literature. My talk touched on three important components: Zandukht's writings, the social-political context in which Zandukht is writing in response, and the theoretical dimension that I will talk about. First of all, I would concentrate on the notion of the fragmentation of the self when it comes to reading Zandukht Shirazi. One of the most striking passage or writing by Zandukht is her verse that she's writing to herself, and it's written under a photo of her. And in that verse, but before I get into the verse, Zandukht Shirazi is a 20th century woman poet. Her actual name was Fakhrulmuluk Zanpur. In different phases, she changed her name to Zandukht Shirazi to express her feminist aspirations. In that photo, in which she writes a verse to herself, and she's actually in dialogue with herself, she says that ای عکس به عکس من خوش و شاد هستی از قید حجاب و پیچه آزاد هستی. Oh photo, unlike me, happy and cheerful you are, free from veiling and covering you are. In a retrospective look at herself in that verse, she's indicating her desire to be free and unveiled. So I know that temporally that's something very unique and important, that at the same time she's bringing past and present to that very moment she's communicating with herself. But more important than that, it indicates a kind of divided self, a fragmented self. And I would like to draw our attention that where this divideness, where this divide self come from. Yuval Davis explains that in nationalism, in the project of nationalism in the Middle East, which is true about the case of Iran, women are positioned in an ambivalent position. Women are often, she explains, women are often constructed as the cultural symbols of the collectivity, of its boundaries, as carriers of the collectivity's honor, and as its intergenerational reproducers of culture. She continues and says, however, as cultures are not homogeneous and specific hegemonic constructions of cultures closely relate to the interests of the dominant leadership within the collectivity, these hegemonic constructions often go against the interests of women, who would therefore find themselves in an ambivalent position toward this hegemonic project. And as we all know, for example, during the constitutional revolution in Iranian nationalism, the constitutional revolution was not fully successful because women were not able to approve their right to vote, suffrage. Like Yuval Davis, Partha Chatterjee, in his studies of South Asian societies, especially South Asian women who were experiencing modernization in their society, he comes with this conclusion that by modernizing themselves, by experiencing this modern way of life in South Asia, women were introduced a new system of patriarchy. And it was more about making a balance between the traditional system of patriarchy and the modern and new way of patriarchy. And this ambivalent position, ambivalent call, put women in a fragmented, in a position that would see themselves and describe themselves as fragmented. In one of her articles that Zandukht Shirazi published in Ayande Iran magazine, she has a poetry, she has a poem that in the title, she talks about, I'm glad that I'm one of the daughters of Iran, in which she is explaining her national self. But the whole poem is all about her deep grief about the situation she's been, her bored feeling, her sadness. She's escaping people, she's avoiding the public life, isolating herself at home. And at the end, she explains that I'm so regretful of my behavior, and it's not quite clear why she's regretful. Is it because she's isolating herself, or is it because the things she has done before in the public, and that led, to her isolation at home? But what is interesting is that she's putting her personal self in dialogue with her national self. And this national self that she's displaying in this poetry, in this poetic writing, is the way she described it, conveys that it's transparent to her personal self too, which is a fragmented self. In that very article, she also has a poem which describes her nature as a woman poet, and she puts that in dialogue and in relation to natural world. At the same time, she's bringing this universal self of in the press. Still in that projection of her universal self, she's still bringing this fragmented notion of the self. She explains that, for example, I am very true to my nature, but as the natural world can be various, can have like different colors of flowers, day and night and moon. There are different components, a variety in that natural world. My nature can be varying at some point, and when my nature is also a mirror to the social political context, because if I see something beautiful, I will talk of beautiful things. If I don't see something nice, I would talk in a very restless way or in a bad way. At the end, she explains that I have no problem with my restless nature. Again, another fragmental, but in a universal sense. Even in her style of writing, she projects this fragmentation as well. She uses, at least in that very article that she's bringing those two poetry, her national self and her universal self, she uses poem and prose back and forth, which is actually a good feature to think of, because that's an oral feature that she's bringing to modern Persian writing or in the press. During the Constitutional Revolution, it is common that we see that prose and poetry come together in many ways, but Zandukht is one of those figures, even decades after the revolution, she's extensively using that style, which is something significant because, again, it's an oral quality that she's bringing to Persian writing. Speaking of fragmentation, Judy Butler's idea of gender as performativity is also important, because Judy Butler described that gender is series of acts that are repetitively happening, and it's not something other than that. Those repetition of action creates some kind of effect, that effect makes us think that gender is something natural. However, that effective component quality makes us to think of gender as something has a fragmentary nature. I read a quotation from Judy Butler. She says, the reconceptualization of identity as an effect, that is, as produced or generated, opens up possibility of agency that are insidiously foreclosed by positions that take identity categories as foundational and fixed. For an identity to be an effect means that it is neither fatally determined nor fully artificial and arbitrary. That the constituted status of identity is misconstrued, allowing these two two conflicting lines suggests the way in which the feminist discourse and cultural construction remains trapped within the unnecessary binarism of free will and determinism. Construction is not opposed to agency. It is the necessary scene of agency, the very term in which agency is articulated and becomes culturally intelligible. So when it comes to Zandukht's writing and the idea of fragmentation, I would like to concentrate on her writing, her poetic writing, because that vibrant, I have to look at my notes, because that type of, that theory of gender that explains we are involved in certain act that can have some hybrid and incoherent or fragmented nature. And that involves in a language that you can play with meaning, with a style, with a structure, and that's where Zandukht finds this space, to reveal her agency and subvert certain notions of gender or practices in modern Persian context. I would like to pause here. I had more to talk about Judy Butler and even a criticism against her based on Zandukht writing, but for the sake of time, I skipped that part, and I appreciate your attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's fine. Thank you.
Have more time to speak.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Sara.
You're welcome.
So we'll be hosting our second presenter, Eszter. Eszter Can is also a PhD student in Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations at the University of Toronto under the supervision of Professor Saghi. With extensive training in philology, she holds a BA in Indian Studies with a minor in Iranian Studies, specializing in exploration of classical and modern languages and literature from both regions.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. Today, I will be speaking about Zhaleh Esfahani, a 20th century Iranian woman poet and intellectual, and her memoir, Zhaleh, The Shadow of Years, written around 1994-5 and published in 2000 in London. This is a new archive for me, so I would love to hear your feedback and suggestions as well. And as an initial attempt to read her works, I have been looking at her memoir and poetry using and thinking of Edward Said's contrapuntal reading and the worldly consciousness of the exile. Zhaleh Esfahani opens her memoir with these lines. I won't read it out loud because we don't have much time, but
Please speak louder because they ask it.
okay. But it is part of the preface to her memoir, and it's really interesting in from various perspectives. Years slip away like shooting stars, but their shadows remain with us. It is words that a person shares only with themselves. From the very first page, we encounter a woman poet in her 70s, reflecting on the passing of time and her own displacement, both physical, as you can read, a woman who, amid the great tides of Iran and the world's political and social upheavals, has spent her days in the forced migration of her time, both emotional and even literary. She writes that to dwell on the margins, she feels like she is in a marginal position, and she is not in the center, as you can see here, but she takes this attempt and the effort to look back at her life and her exilic years. These shadows in the title gestures toward memory, loss, and some sort of continuity, but also toward a shadowed self, an identity, a self that exists only in reflections, not in full light, Zhaleh's refusal to fit her work into established genres, literary genres, when she writes, "It is words, a memoir is not poetry, fiction, drama, or even journalism, each bound by its own conventions and rules. It is words that a person shares only with themselves, with the simplicity, fragmentation, and unpretentiousness." But what does she exactly mean by حرفایی که انسان به خود خویش در میان می‌گذارد? Indeed, a work that can hardly be confined in any generic categories, The Shadow of Years begins much like a novel or even like a play, unfolding through dialogues and detailed descriptions of Esfahan's alleys, anecdotes about a little schoolgirl's, Mastana's daily life. But who is this Mastana? Zhaleh's given name was Mastana Soltani. She was born in 1921 in Esfahan and began writing early, which led Mohammad Taghi Bahar to invite her to the first Iranian Writers' Congress in 1946, which year, this year, 46, marked her first exile when, with her husband, a Tuda party member, they had to escape to the Soviet Union, and for the next 3 decades, she lived in the second world between Baku and Moscow, teaching Persian literature and participating in what Samuel Hodgkin recently termed the Soviet literary internationalism. And also, she was raising 2 sons. She was deeply integrated into these transnational socialist communist literary networks, especially in the Persianate Central Asia. She traveled to Tashkent, Dushanbe, Moscow, Baku, everywhere. And her second exile came after 1982, when she returned to Iran for a brief period of time after the victory of the revolution, just to be imprisoned in Evin, and then in 82 she was once more was forced to exile, this time to London, where she stayed until 2007. Zhaleh appears only as a shadow of her formal self, Mastana, who is the main narrator and character of the memoir, and who shares her quite lengthy 420-page long life story. Zhaleh uses this dialogue between herself and her former childhood self as an effective and really powerful narrative technique, and also to reflect this kind of dual identity of the exilic writer. Both speakers are much like shadows, especially Zhaleh, the public poet figure, whose name is barely mentioned, only once or twice, and who appears only through her frequent direct addresses to Mastana and through this really interesting poetic play with Mastana, the word itself. As you can see here, it is frequently used as an adverb as well, when she will reflect on this kind of, again, like this dual feeling of her memoir is like generally really elegiac, really hopeless. So there is a sense of like hopelessness, not non-belonging, but at the same time she remained like really hopeful. And as you can see here, she uses Mastana as an adverb. The greatest happiness of a human being is to live drunkenly and thus think less of the futility of their existence, of death. This self-division between Mastana and Zhaleh stages the duality of exile, the impossibility of returning to a unified I and subject because of the distance from the homeland, let's say. This duality governs the whole text, which oscillates between prose and poetry, first and third person narrations, events on her public life, the course of history, global geopolitical events, and then the text shifts to more personal and private introspections that come up remembering the past. But as the organization of its chapters reveals as well, the volume's central preoccupations remain exile, displacement, and belonging. And according to Said, his most cited phrasing what he means by contrapuntal reading or consciousness, he writes that most people are principally aware of one culture, one setting, one home. Exiles are aware of at least two, and this plurality of vision gives rise to an awareness of simultaneous dimensions, an awareness that, to borrow a phrase from music, is contrapuntal. This worldly awareness and critical ability manifest in Zhaleh's work too, which also made her voice that for her the superpowers were the margins and Iran was the heart of her world. Zhaleh was deeply concerned about her reception, the reception of her poetry in Iran, whether anyone would read and remember her poetry and her figure. And to a certain extent, her figure did become obscure due to her disconnection from the revolutionary literary circles before 1979, and on the one hand, and on the other, also because of her political, explicitly political connections and commitment reflected in her poetry that you can see here, which hindered her recognition post-revolution. Even though she was suspicious toward any kind of power, whether monarchical, Soviet, or imperial in general, we found a lot of poems similar to this in her volumes. But as she phrased in her memoir once, at one point, Zhaleh's poetry wasn't only Sher Das Csekkos or the poetry of the hammer and the sickle. It was a fusion of lyricism and more didactic political messaging, but because of her distance from Iran and peripherality compared to the center of Iran's literary circles before the revolution, her poetry retained a more classical and Nemaic form than, for example, the experimental free verse, more military, agitational like Cherokee poetry of her contemporaries within Iran, which in and of itself is a really interesting aspect. In terms of her themes, the poems showcase a wide variety of images, including cities, seas, forests, natural imagery, revolutionary martyrs, mothers of martyrs, war, and my favorites, Kahkashan, Satara, space, galaxies and stars, moons as well. And my ultimate favorites are the Soviet cosmonauts. As you can see here, she dedicated a poem to the first woman cosmonaut, Valentina Tereshkova. And I'm not sure whether she visited this metro station in Tashkent because it was built in the late 80s, I guess. But it is just really fascinating that her fascination with space travel. And this kind of interest of hers parallels her own life of movement across nations, countries, and continents. It's really no surprise that the poems she chose to include in her memoir to orbit around places, cities, and shifting geographies that map her emotional world. A recurring practice of hers or technique of hers was to use these urban landscapes, as you can see here, Leningrad, Norway, Oslo, Florence, Tajikistan. She visited Doshanbe, Stalinabad back then. She uses these natural landscapes and urban landscapes especially to bring back her memories of Iran. And as you can see here as well, Norway, Oslo reminded her of Mazandaran. باز اینجا کوه و جنگلزار و دریا یادم آرد منظر مازندران را. Or in another poem, از یاد دیدار تو شادم زیرا تو ایران مرا آری به یادم. and Italy made her happy because of its resemblance of Iran. Even though she felt that she could always be connected to her motherland through her mother tongue and find joy in her cultural and literary excursions, an elegiac sense of permanent marginality and of being nowhere at home permeates Zhaleh's poetry. Said describes this contrapuntal, as you can see here as well, how similar it was to Tehran, the free Tehran of her imagination. Rome reminded her the streets of Tehran, or the imagined streets of Tehran. Said describes this contrapuntal reading as a method of bringing together seemingly distant and unrelated histories within a single literary work, and as a mode of reading that uncovers connections among these distant and otherwise isolated temporal and spatial narratives. Zhaleh Esfahani's poetry attains a really worldly dimension, not only because of these different geographical spaces mentioned in her poetry and her exile from the third world to the second and the first, but also through its ongoing kind of negotiation of how to inhabit these different spaces of empires and countries and nations, to exist between the poles of the center and the periphery. The contrapuntal is a lived experience for her, a way of writing, remembering, and enduring displacement. I will finish with this poem in 1 minute. So Zhaleh's long poem, London, beautifully illustrates this kind of contrapuntal vision, being aware of both the periphery and the center. So first, this poem titled London reads as a romantic hymn to spring and London's different spectacles and wealth, but then as it unfolds, this admiration turns into a political critique. The city's beauties are becoming reminders of imperial plunder and global inequality. To read the poem contrapuntally, as Said suggests, is not to resolve this tension, but to hold both melodies or both kind of counterpoints together. London is both a muse for her, the metropole, the beauty and injustice, aesthetic wonder and moral discomfort. Her gaze, even amid London's beauty, turns toward the suffering of others. The poem's geography expands from the center, the imperial center, to the global stages and sites of conflict, military conflict, especially here in Khuzestan, references made to Khuzestan and the Iran-Iraq War, and Lebanon as well. This is the worldly awareness of Esfahani's exile, the simultaneous awareness of empire and periphery, privilege and dispossession, but here as well, her revolutionary commitment coexists with a broader kind of humanistic and really romantic vision, one that wishes for harmony among the vast, chaotic flood of people. And in conclusion, what I really wanted to highlight here is that her memoir reveals several layers of contrapuntal subjectivity and peripherality, temporal, gendered, positional, ideological, spatial, which produces her exilic double vision, the ability to see both the beauty and the violence, and to perceive life as a continuous search and desire for a better world. And I will finish here. Sorry for taking.
Thank you so much, Eszter Can, for your brilliant presentation. Our next presenter will be Mahnaz Nezarati. So Mahnaz Nezarati is an Iranian, Canadian, multidisciplinary artist whose work explored the sociological and psychological dynamics of women in patriarchal Middle Eastern societies, especially Iran. She holds a Bachelor of Applied Arts and a Master of Applied Arts in Traditional Arts and Handicrafts from Tehran Arts University, and a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Drawing and Painting from Okaj University. Mahnaz Can?
Thank you. What an honor to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this beautiful presentation and symposium. Can you hear me well? Okay, awesome. Is it going to be vibrant like that? Okay.
No.
Okay, awesome. So the title of Mirror-Gazed Woman Observing Woman is the theme of my talk today, but the work I will show come from my ongoing woman series. I kept women's on this slide because it carries so many layers. It speaks to women's lives, roles, and shared experiences shaped by history, culture, and emotion. It's where this whole exploration of how women relate to one another first began. Women's series bring together drawing, painting, animation, and installation to explore the complex dynamics between women. It's really about those internal relationships we have with each other, the connections, the competitions, and how social and cultural expectations shape the way we relate to one another. The series looks closely to everyday interactions among Iranian women, especially during simple rituals like tea gathering, where affection and judgment often coexist. In my ongoing research, I describe these moments as a technology of moral vision, a socially learned way of seeing in which care and connection can quietly turn into judgment without us realizing it. My goal with this series was not to create a space, was actually to create a space to reflect on those subtle layers, what's often left unspoken in our interactions. I will be showing 4 pieces today, but each captures a different aspect of this mirrored gaze between women. The first piece that was actually created in this series is titled Woman's Tea. Women's series bring together, Women's Tea actually brings these 3 figures in 3 different panels, explores relationship between women through the familiar rituals of tea sharing, which is central to our Iranian culture. The panels picture intimate, informal gathering where we naturally open up and become vulnerable. Yet even in those close, comforting spaces, there is always the quiet possibility of judgment or gossip. I wanted to capture here the tension beneath that warmth, how moment that feels safe can also hold unease. I think these scenes as showing how care and correction can blur together, how look or word of concern can also teach us how to behave. In Iran, women's relationships are shaped by many overlapping forces, cultural, religious, political, and historical. These shared conditions create both solidarity and pressure, shaping how women navigate closeness, empathy, and expectations. What draws me in visually is the duality, how unity and surveillance, support and judgment can exist in the same moment. My work looks at those quiet negotiations of care and conformity, where friendship becomes both a refuge and a mirror. At the same time, these friendships can quietly lead to moments of isolations, doubt, or fear. I think this as a mirror turning inward, when the wish to belong slowly becomes a kind of self-watching. It's part of what I describe as a moral gaze, when care, approval, and even love start to shape how we see ourselves. That tension between closeness and self-consciousness is what this is about, this piece is about. In this piece, the actual reason and goal is to capture the moment when quiet tension surfaces, when something unspoken suddenly needs to be addressed. I'm interested in how authority appears between women, not as domination, but as the belief that correction is a form of care. In my research, I think of this as an emotional core of moral gaze, when guidance and control become almost indistinguishable. The next piece I would like to introduce is Tea Talks and Chess Walks. Tea Talks and Chess Walks is a piece where I use chess, teacups, and a cowhide rug to explore the politics of attitude and the quiet strategies women develop to move within social systems. I actually designed and carved the chess bench as a piece back in 2011 as my final project for my first bachelor degrees in traditional handicraft of Iran, where I specialize in woodworking, and the bench is made of walnut and red dace wood. In this work, the chessboard isn't just a symbol of competition. It's about strategy, balance, and endurance. It reflects how women often learn to play the game with grace, intelligence, and restraint, even within structures that limits them. In my ongoing research, I connect this to what I call the politics of moral vision and movement. How behavior, tone, and presence become tools of negotiation and subtle resistance in patriarchal setting. The chessboard and players are the core of this installation because there is a strong parallel between women's relationships and the game of chess. Each element acts as a metaphor. The board becomes a stage where two women navigate power, identity, and choice. The moves they make reflect not only competition but also strategy, patience, and emotional intelligence, the quiet skills women often develop to survive within social hierarchies. Conceptually, I think about this as a part of politics of attitude, how women learn to move through constraint with subtlety and intention, turning survival itself into a form of a strategy. The chess pieces themselves are storytellers. Sometimes we are just players being moved by someone else's strategy, and other times we are the ones orchestrating the game. The teacups add another layer, symbolizing shared experiences and connections. Sharing tea becomes a metaphor for the refuge women find in each other. Within societal pressures and the cowhide rugs beneath the chess table is more than a luxurious item. It symbolizes sacrifice, death, and power dynamics within the domestic spaces. With this piece, I want viewers to reflect on the psychological dimensions of choices and power in relationships. It's a space to think about how something as simple as a chess move or a shared cup of tea can reflect a deeper narratives about power, comfort, and sacrifice within the context of feminism. The third piece I would like to introduce is titled Beyond Blame, an Offering of Liberation. The way Eve's role in the fall from grace has been interpreted in patriarchal societies like Iran has led to negative stereotypes about women. The narrative often portrays women as the cause of temptation and sin, reinforcing the idea that they need to be controlled to protect men's morality. It's been used as a tool to limit women's freedom, suppress their voices, and keep them out of many areas of life, whether it's work, politics, and even just being visible in the public spaces. By casting women as inherently manipulative and dangerous, this interpretation has driven gender inequality and justified controlling women's behavior. In my recent research, I think of it as a part of a broader system I call the bureaucracy of virtue, where obedience and modesty are turned into measure of moral worth. As Iranian women, we often hear the phrase, "It's because of you that my husband, son, or any man has gone astray. Your appearance, your laugh, the way that you talk, sit, it caused them to fall from the grace." And this accusation often comes from another woman. But it raises an important question. Can you clap with one hand? The last piece I would like to show you is Harfnoosh. Harfnoosh is a short experimental animation where I use traditional paint-on-glass techniques combined with frame-by-frame animation in Photoshop to create a dreamy, layered visual piece. The animation, like the rest of the women's series, blends symbols of femininity like teacups, textile, and pattern. And with both realistic and abstract painting style, I aim to create that multi-layer feelings that women usually experience during social gatherings. The name Harfnoosh comes from two Persian words. Harf meaning word and speech, noosh meaning to drink. It's about how during these tea conversations we take in each other's words, whether good or bad, just like we sip the tea. And I draw inspiration from Rumi's word, the speaker of the word, the listener of the word, and the words themselves. All three become spirit in the end. It shows how something as ordinary as sharing tea becomes meaningful exchange that resonates long after. I would like to invite you to watch the very short animation piece I made. With that, I would like to ask three simple questions. As you can see on the screen, do you see how love can turn into law when heart goes afraid? Can you look upon one another not to measure but to understand? And will you open your eyes to see with mercy, not judgment, so that love may free us? Thank you so much. I wanted to thank you, everyone who organized this beautiful symposium, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much, Mahnaz John. And so we are moving to our next presenter who will be presenting on Zoom. She's not here because she's in Vancouver. Saghi Ehteshamzadeh. Saghi Ehteshamzadeh is a queer, interdisciplinary, Vancouver-based artist and curator. She holds a Bachelor of Cinema Studies from Art University of Tehran and graduating from Capilano University's Art and Entertainment Management program in North Vancouver. Saghi's diverse artistic backgrounds informs their creative endeavors. Saghi John, we are here to listen to your presentation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Saghi. It's a true honor to be joining you today for this wonderful symposium. I would like to thank Leila Jan for her invitation and ongoing support. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the stolen and ceded territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. As an immigrant on these lands, I am very grateful for the opportunity to learn, grow, curate, and play on this beautiful land. I would like to begin with a short introduction of my work. I was born and raised in Tehran, Iran, and I only immigrated to Canada, Vancouver in 2021. I got my Bachelor of Cinema Studies from Art University of Tehran, but shortly after, I shifted towards visual art and landed in an interdiscipline between visual art and cinema, which for me is video art and live visuals. Today, I want to share some of my work and my personal experience with gender oppression and queerness growing up in Iran, and how those experiences shaped my relationship with my femininity, body, and artistic expression. I would like to begin with my work here, Natars, which you can now see on the screen. This is a mixed media work. The word Natars has been hand sewn on a menstruation pad, which I've later placed on a collage of archival images of this forced ceremonial religious ceremony called Jasht Taklif. Natars in Farsi as an adjective means brave, and as a verb it means don't be afraid. So this religious ceremony is a celebration that every girl in Iran at the age of 9 has to attend. The age of 9 is usually when the beginning of adolescence and beginning of puberty. So it's the age that a lot of girls experience their first period. And that's where the age where the religious authorities declare that a girl has been duty-bound in religion. So from that day forward, all girls should wear hijab even around their uncles and their male cousins. And the ceremony is pretty glammed up. It's presented as a happy milestone. The clothing is decorated, the event is festive, but underneath all, it marks, at least for me in my experience, the beginning of gender oppression. At the age when a child should still be a child, carefree, she's told that now her identity and her body and her existence is being observed as a sexual object in the world, which in its own, in the moment, might be way deeper than a child can comprehend. But it took me years to realize that this feeling of being seen as impure or shameful planted a deep scar and was the beginning of gender oppression for me. Because when you're going on your period, in the forced religious rules that we experience as young women in Iran, we are told that we cannot pray, we cannot read the holy book. So as a child, you feel like because of what a natural thing that is a part of your feminine identity, you are separated from everyone else, which I think only adds to the very uncomfortable experience of menstruation that a human can experience at an early age. As I grow older, this sense of confinement deepened. In Iran, schools are separated by gender, so I spent most of my time naturally in school surrounded by the same sex. It's natural in adolescence to begin developing feelings and attractions, but in that environment, those emotions are met with confusion and fear. being queer in Iran is not only a taboo, but it's also criminalized. So any curiosity or tenderness you must feel, it must be buried deep down inside you. So being queer still in this, like in today, is still a taboo, or like coming out, even in a lot of liberal societies and families, is still a hard and scary procedure for a lot of people. But add to that the layer that this is not only a taboo, this is a sin, and you are a criminal. Your identity and your existence in itself can make you a sinner. So it makes you push down all the emotions that you have around your identity and your expression to a place that might be very hard to later open up and express. Because expressing your identity, simply being in your existence, that can lead to you being a criminal. This double layer of gender and sexuality creates a heavy silence. For me, it turned into self-rejection of my feminine identity. I used to detest my femininity. At the age of 21, 22, I used to pray that if there is another life and if I come back, I want to come back as a male, because all I could experience, all I could feel was that my feminine identity is just a burden, to my existence and to my experience. But everything began to shift for me when I immigrated to Canada. Suddenly, I had space, both physical and emotional, to breathe, to create, and to speak freely about things that I wanted to express. And shortly after, the woman life freedom movement in Iran started happening. Watching those incredibly brave women take to streets to reclaim to their voices, their hair, their right to live freely, their right to show their existence as female bodies, awakened something in me. It was through art that I found my own way to join the movement from afar. Natars emerged during that time as a way to reclaim courage and befriend my femininity. The movement and this experience led me to create works like In Touch. So In Touch is about being in touch with your femininity, something that I had been ignoring for years because the feeling of rejecting my femininity got to extreme that I hated every single aspect of femininity in my physical body. I did not feel comfortable in my body. And at times, it even showed up as physical symptoms. So for me, it was a moment to think back and to be comfortable and to praise this feminine power, because I was seeing that all this female power is just creating change, and it's a path forward in a gender oppression that has been ongoing in Iran for years and years. Another work that I created during this moment was Unveiling Their Power. So this piece is an ode to the resilience and bravery of the Iranian women, depicting freedom that grows from their endurance and witnessing the strength of these women as resolute and unyielding as Damavand, a symbol of persistence. So again, I have used here a menstruation pad from which there are growing sprouts. Again, it looks back as the most natural procedure that a female body goes through, which is menstruation, which leads to birth, which leads to creating life. And in Iran, just like as many other countries in the world, discussing or displaying menstruation has been a taboo subject for years. However, during the Women Life Freedom Revolution, there was a very interesting moment where women started using these menstruation pads to cover surveillance video cameras in public spaces such as SkyTrain stations, so they can be free. They can be free in their female identity. They can show their hair. They can dance. They can sing, all of which are illegal for women to do in Iran. So for me, this work, it's to it's to praise their bravery and the power that come from the resilience that these women are showing, and to not judge anything about this female body, anything natural that comes from this female body. Throughout this procedure of going through the movement and learning about all these women that are sharing their voices, I started reading more about femininity from a philosophical aspect and from even through biology. And I got to mitosis, the phenomena that explains how a female egg in its own can create life without needing any male component. And it clicked something in me. It made me realize that this is the reason that we are experiencing gender oppression and gender inequality, not only in Iran, but everywhere else, like a lot of other places in the world, even in like countries and societies that present themselves as liberal. We still see a lot of gender inequality, and that comes from this huge power that femininity beholds, creating life in its own. Of course, that creates patriarchy because of the scare that is around what femininity can create and behold. So all of this led me to befriend my femininity, to praise my identity, to look at it as a symbol of power. My latest work is called Unheld. This is an experimental audiovisual piece that explores tender moments of disassociation and dislocation in female bodies, gestures of release that signal a quiet liberation from systems of oppression. It serves as a requiem for displacement, holding on to fragments of home while embracing an identity that can only begin to emerge at a distance from homeland. So Unheld is a collaboration with my great friend Kimia Kuchakiazadeh Yazdi, who is a brilliant musician. It's about our shared emotional landscape and the deep sense of mutuality and connection that we both bring, that is sparked from our experience with our femininity and dislocation and displacement in diaspora. I would like to invite you to see this video with me. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. It was an honor to be here.
Thank you, John. So I hope people on Zoom can hear us well. So we'll be starting the question and answer. Okay. So those on Zoom, if you have any questions, you can just drop it in the chat box, or you can like raise your hand, unmute yourself, and here today, you're most welcome to ask your questions from our presenters.
I had a question about that learning poetry. I think about that animation one. So yeah, I mean, it's sort of a when did you do that? And then did you like what when we try to make AI models, like we type something in edges with verbalization and things, and then it turns it into a thing. But your approach was a little bit different. I mean, I'm curious to know what was the process, and then how did you come across that when, and you just a little bit like explain more, and then this kind of, did you get any inspiration from other parts? Like how can we even imagine this with the image how to do it? Because what
Thank you. I made the piece and between 2020 and 2021. Final physics from this factor. I was at university. I was hybrid between drawing and painting and experimental animation. So I did my physics with that. I wanted to use my drawing and painting skills as a form that I can see that is used. So that inspires me to bring and to use a very time-consuming process of paint and glass, and which you would basically have to hand all.
A little bit about the animation.
But when it comes to art, you sometimes get inspired by the itself, and then you move into the different layers that you combine your words, the words that you find for your own
with the imagery. So I hope that helps with that process.
But regarding what you said about AI, that's absolutely true, because now I'm working on a piece that I'm using AI for that.
Since you mentioned, I wanted to say that it's actually very interesting to see how these two can, move around and create a different, work for you.
Yeah, thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you all for your amazing talk. My question is to Eszter. A question and a comment. Zhaleh is a fascinating person. I mean, perhaps nobody in the corpus of Persian literature traveled as much as she did, as far as I can tell. Part of that contemporary kind of socialist look, especially the literary one, could be looked at as a travelogue, perhaps. That when she travels from one country to another and she reports back her perception of that country. And then if you put them together, all together, we talked about last year, I talked to Samuel about, looking at Zhaleh's poetry in that regard, rather as a traveler, especially the ones that are written about her travels. I think that would solve some of the problems of what you mentioned as contemporary. Yes. So I think it would solve some of that problem. My question is, whether her poetry made any influence on Central Asian female poets. I read somewhere, and don't quote me on this, that Golrukhsar Safiyeva mentioned that she had huge influence on her. So, but I wanted to know your opinion, whether she made any influence in Central Asia, especially.
That's a really good question. She was, yes, okay, I
Okay. Okay. So yes, I think her memoir could be read as a travelogue as well, and I'm not sure how to read it. It can be read as a poetic commentary on her life and travels, or a commentary on her poetry, and this kind of contextualizing commentary on her poetry, which is really interesting. In and of itself, how it shows how her life travels, the Soviet Union, London, the Iranian Revolution informed her poetry, because you have all these slogans and different layers, like the classical tradition and Bagh and Setar and Ma and everything. And then the really communist socialist slogans, Dasto Chakosh, and also this. Yeah, so it's a really interesting mixture. And in terms of genres as well, so it starts as a novel, kind of describing how Mastan's or Zhaleh's childhood, how her father didn't want to let her go to school, and it was her mother who insisted. And then we have a dialogue, a lot of dialogues. It reads like a play, so it's really interesting. I don't know how to read this. I'm just I have recently started working on her memoir and poetry more in detail. And regarding your question, she was really integrated to this socialist literary network. If you are interested, Samuel Hodgkin's recent book is really a fascinating read. The Persianate verse, so she met a lot of women writers and poets in these literary majlises and gatherings in Dushanbe, Baku, Moscow, everywhere in the Soviet Union. Golchehre, Golrukhsar Safiyeva, but I can see the connections. So I mean, probably there are connections, but I haven't looked at, for example, in really Golrukhsar Safiyeva's poetry yet. But I'm really fascinated with this Central Asian kind of literary gathering, so I might do that later. So I have encountered her poetry because when she went back to Iran after the revolution won, she got to publish a couple of revolutionary poems. Before the revolution, she was banned and she couldn't find ways to publish within Iran. She met a few Iranian scholars like Said Nafisi, and also another Pur. They met in Tashkent. So she had some connections to these literary revolutionary circles, but not that much. And because I'm mostly working on Iranian women revolutionaries and their committed poetry before and during the revolution. So that's how I encountered her works. Thank you. I can go on talking.
I was really impressed with 4 brilliant presentations and pairing to literary and artistic works together. Really brilliant, full of great ideas. Just as a response to our colleagues, I'm sort of hesitant to reduce a very complex, dynamic, temporal and spatial structure of the poetry and the poems that you presented to a well-established genre of travelogue. You know, it will compromise the complexity of the poem and reduces to reporting back.
And she did refuse to do that. She said, like, explicitly writes in her preface that it's not fiction, it's not drama, it's nothing, but I just want to talk to my former self. And it's really public facing because she publishes it in London, but it doesn't have to really fit into any of these kind of literary genres, which is really fascinating.
We still have time? We do. Okay, so any question? Yes, sure.
I also agree with a set of brilliant and very creative presentations, and especially Saghi. I think that we don't have much information about Jashn Takrif, which I considered one of the really foremost representation of a state violence on women's bodies, and so your work is very important, and I'm glad that you are doing. I have a question for Sara. You started with the concept of ambivalent and then fragmentation, and I was also interested in the way that you are using the notion of the fragmentation. But then through your presentation, you left ambivalent alone, and you talked about fragmentation. And I want you to come back to it and tell me, where is that ambivalent? I know that you use Nira Yuval Davis, but she has been criticized for that notion because she used it in 1997 and never went back to it, as she was talking about the contradiction of nationalism and modernity. So I want you to tell me how you're using it for Zandukht.
Thank you very much for your question. In the case of Iranian nationalism, at least when we look at, for example, the inclusion of women in the project of nationalism, including women, the importance of women education, the importance of the discourse on women's equal rights, especially when it comes to the right to vote. Those are the issues that have been extensively discussed in the Constitutional Revolution and at some point promised, but the Constitutional Revolution was not that advantageous to women because women were not able eventually to establish their right to vote. Not even during the revolution, the Constitutional Revolution, but even it took decades after that to make that happen. What I noticed, a lot of thinkers early in Iranian nationalism, including the Constitutional Revolution, they are having an instrumentalist approach towards the inclusion of women. But in practice, we don't see that much progress or progression in the case of women. The Constitutional Revolution, when it was over, there is a still problem for women to publish their writing in the press. Like magazines like Shokufe, they've been stopped. They were under a lot of pressures. They had to go through a lot of censorship because there are a lot of political and social and cultural pressures against women. Or the magazine like Danish. Even when it comes to Zaban Zanan, who Sadiq Daulat Abadi was running that magazine. She was exiled, she was persecuted. So the constitutional revolution happened. It was successful in some, to some extent, but it was not able to fully establish women's even public recognition. And that, public recognition in terms of even publishing their work, let alone their legal rights or their suffrage. So that's the ambivalence I see in the case of Iranian nationalism. In other words, maybe with a good summary, that theoretically women were included, but practically they were not included in the making of Iranian nation. So that's the ambivalence. And when we see that women are trying to have this freedom, like Zandukht and Sadiq Daulat Abadi, before there are many other women that are trying to have this freedom in the public to appear unveiled based on their own, personal preference, they're not able to do that. Even Reza Shah in the beginning was, rejecting this, opposing to this idea. Eventually, he was convinced to pass the law, and that was another, that was in a strategic, way that he passed that law, and he unveiled by force Iranian women. So that's the ambivalence that I was, thinking at that moment. Yeah, thank you. Did I answer your question?
Of course, you certainly did, but I think that I want to push a little bit further. Yeah. And it's not the question of ambivalence. And it's not the difference between theory and practice of it. What I would argue is that it is part of the envisioning of the nationhood that women are excluded. It's the mode of thinking. There is no ambivalence there. Women are excluded, are not part of that image of the nation.
But in discourse, there is this discourse for the importance of women's progression because they are half of the nation. So there are things, there are some realization of the importance of women, but maybe not in the best way or ideal way that is supposed to be. So there are even male thinkers who are at some point aware of these even deficiencies or lacking that's going on, but not necessarily maybe raising their voice, even those, men, and of course women.
It needs a little bit of deeper digging.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I think we're done with the first panel. We'll be taking a 30 minutes break and then we'll be back with that. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you all had a chance to stretch, to grab a coffee, and connect with one another. We are now moving on the second panel, titled Embodied Resistance, Mediated Confession, and Decolonial Thoughts. The session brings together a fascinating group of presenters whose work explore how marginalized bodies, voices, and narratives resist dominant power structure, reimagine agency, and create new spaces for solidarity and visibility. We will have 5 presenters, each with about 15 minutes for their talk, and then followed by Q&A and open discussion. One of our presenters will be joining us on Zoom, but the rest of the presenters are here with us in person. Our first presenter is Paria Rahimi. She is a PhD candidate in theory and criticism at Western University, where she researched the intersection of Marxism, psychoanalysis, and theology. Her dissertation, Marxism for the Woman, Life, Freedom, develops a Marxist critique of theocratic political economy of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Paria Jan.
Thank you for the introduction and the invite. The title of my presentation, as you can see, is Jina, Nazli, Vartan with Eszter. And in fact, we have 3 familiar faces: Dr. Tawakkoli Taraqi, Ahmad Shamlu, Aida Sarkisian. The subtitle is Women as Agents of Revolution in the words of Young Women as Agents of Revolution in the words of Ahmad Shamlu. My presentation today is drawn from a larger project and the political poetry of Ahmad Shamlou, which examines the revolutionary figures his poems envision, those who take up the torch of their predecessors and redeem both the past and the future, figures who, strikingly, are young women. Through a close and symptomatic reading of these texts, I argued that across the decades and through multiple historical conjunctures, Shamlou's ideal revolutionary remains unchanged. The young women, often emerging from the margins and peripheries. The girls of his poetry embody libidinal energy in diverse registers of love, eroticism, and puberty. Their bodily impulses, far from private or sentimental, become the very medium of socio-political desire. The convergence of the political, the feminine, and the adolescent is most rigorously figurized by Julia Kristeva, French feminist, whose notion of revolt nuances my reading of Shamlou's poetic account of political girlhood. Placing Shamlou's imagination in dialect with contemporary revolutionary movements in Iran, it suggests that the role he ascribed to young women decades ago has found embodiment in the figures of today's uprisings. The girl of revolution, Street, دختران خیابان انقلاب, the science and research girl, Romina, Nika, and Jina. In both Shamlou's poetry and contemporary Iranian political discourse, the word دختر means the radical young figures at the heart of revolt, simultaneously meaning maiden, young woman, and daughter. It carries erotic and filial undertones that I render as girl, a translation that holds together youth and subjugation, latency and becoming, and that places Shamlou's daughter within a messianic and revolutionary field of emergence, where the body and the political coincide. In the daughters of Nane Darya, دختران Nane Darya, or as we might say, again, we can play with the word daughter here, girl, young women. Shamlou addresses them, daughters of Mother Sea. Our heart is cold and dark. Our hope rests first in God and then in you. دخترای ننه دریا کوممون سرد و سیاس چش امیدمون اول به خدا بعد به شماست. And in the dark song, he pleads, oh God, the girls must not remain silent when the men, despairing and weary, grow old. در ترانه تاریک، خدایا دختران نباید خاموش بمانند هنگامی که مردان نومید و خسته پیر میشوند. What is the significance of this link between fate and girls? What theological or perhaps messianic undertone does Shamlou invoke when he speaks of them? As evident in these examples and elsewhere, the poet's hopes rest not in men, nor even in women, but in young women, in girls. What is it about the girl that invests her with political agency, hope, and radicality? The adolescent girl is a liminal being, neither child nor adult, neither man nor holy woman. She stands on the threshold of becoming, to become woman, to become adult. She embodies potentiality awaiting realization. Her reproductive power is not yet actualized, nor she inherits the privilege of being male. Thus, she remains partly outside the capitalist and patriarchal ageist circuits of exploitation. She is a threshold figure whose very existence unsettles every structure of belonging. By essence, she is a nonconformist. Unmoored, unclaimed, and unrealized, she eludes every form of social capture. She is the moment of prophecy, poised 1 second before the full realization of potential, the womb of futurity, potent with all that is yet to come and to salvage. The figure of young woman in this discussion of politics and revolt is not an essence, but a state of becoming, a way of being in the world. This liminal condition often finds embodiment in young women, yet it can appear in anyone at any moment of life. As Julia Kristeva reminds us, adolescence is less a stage than an open psychic structure. She uses this framing, open structure, a psychic structure. It is open, she writes, insofar as it reawakens what has been repressed physically, politically, and socially. The adolescent moment is marked by rebellion, transgression, and the search for identity, a brief interval of freedom before a new order inevitably reasserts itself. So I've singled out two certain poems. The first one is The Wound of Abai's Heart, از قلب زخمی آبایی. Shamlu wrote from the wound of Abai's heart in memory of Abai, a young teacher and member of Tudeh party in Turkmen Sahra, who was executed by the Pahlavi regime at 25 for his leftist convocations and educational work among the rural poor. To evade censorship, Shamlu first titled it From the Wound of Dear Aman's Heart, Aman Jan, claiming it referred to a folkloric Turkmen figure. The disguise universalized its mourning. After the revolution, Shamlu restored Abai's name, returning the poem to its historical ground. Yet this restoration does not confine the poem's scope. The addresses remain the daughters of the fields, دختران صحرا. Shamlu speaks not merely to the daughters of Turkmen Sahra. It doesn't say دختران ترکمن صحرا, it's دختران دشت. But to all daughters of the land, the phrase the daughters of the fields carries multiple overlapping meanings. Let's review. It evokes the daughters of the Turkmen plain, women of a particular land and struggle, the daughters who labor in the fields, whose bodies sustain life, the daughters whose mother is the field itself, a metaphorical genitive suggesting the land as a generative womb, and ultimately, the daughters who are the field. It's tashbih bali, the feminine embodiment of endurance, fertility, and revolt. Through this polysemy, Shamlu transforms the field from a mere geographical site into a maternal revolutionary principle, making the daughters both born of and identical with the land they cultivate and defend. The first half of the poem unfolds as a lyrical description of these young women. They are of the field, they await, anticipation itself defines their existence. They live within a messianic suspension of time where the pulse of hope beats against the stillness of despair. They wait for what cannot be named, perhaps their own vanishing, for their lives, enclosed by labor and poverty, offer no future beyond repetition. They are, in every sense, the daughters of bounded hopes. Their dreams may be boundless, yet their hopes remain confined. They long, they yearn, they ache in blue. Their arms are worked in labor rather than dance. They are innocent, industrious, and perpetually exhausted. Sorry, it was. What happened? Yeah, sorry. Then, breaking his long silence, the poet turns to them with a series of piercing questions, as you can see in the slide. From the wound of Abai's heart into the breast of which of you has his blood sipped, in whose breast has the spring of his youth blossomed? Through the dim nights, which of you, daughters, lies awake with the tormenting secret, keeping his memory alive in your sleepless eyes? This climatic interrogation transforms the poem from elegy into invocation, a call for the daughters of the field to carry forward the unfulfilled promise of Abai's youth. These young women, fresh from puberty, awakening to desire, are libidinal rather than erotic. Their blossoming unfolds in tandem with Abai's own springtime of maturity. They are heirs to the blood of a wounded heart, the legacy of a political martyr, entrusted with a revolutionary mission to revenge Abai, to the love of their innocent hearts, the upward surge of their fountain-like arms, and the restless energy of their desire all participate in dismantling the patriarchal order, revolting against the despotic regime, and taking up the revolutionary weapon of their teacher-lover. The tension between elegy and invocation culminates when the poet pleads, "Tell me, which one among you daughters, which one will sharpen Abai's sword for the day of vengeance?" The poet repeats, "Tell me" twice, as if the girls could truly answer him. The poem would remain coherent even without this imperative, yet syntax turns rhetorical address into dialogue, inviting the girls not merely as symbols but as interlocutors. Within this imagined exchange, at least one among them emerges, one whose libidinal force is transfigured into the radical labor of justice and revolt. Shamlu's lifelong confidant, Askari Pashai, wondered why Shamlu entrusted Abai's weapon to young women rather than men, delegating to them the traditionally masculine task of vengeance. Shamlu replied, "The life of these girls is nothing but their embarrassment of their womanhood, but nature and sheep, and the inferiority of their sex. Abai sacrificed his life, wishing the plain would be freed from poverty and silence, hoping the girls of Turkmen Sahara would blossom from the confining armor of their garments, live shoulder to shoulder with their male partners, and raise their fountain-like arms in a thankful dance of fulfillment." Sympathetic to the two parties' class struggle, Shamlu also sought to free these silenced women from the shame of sexual and social inferiority. The poem thus becomes not only an elegy for a fallen comrade, but also a declaration of gender equality and the liberation of women from silence, confinement, and repression. In this poem, Shamlu frames his political poetics around the feminine conception of inheritance. The girls are not merely holders of Abai's sentiments, but bearers of his wound, his unfinished task, his socio-political trauma. His heart wound becomes a transmissible legacy, calling upon the daughters to continue the struggle. The revolt begins in mourning. They redeem the life of the dead through the blood and love they carry in their hearts. Vartan Salakhanian. The death of my timing is different. The death of Nazli mirrors from the death of Nazli, or the death of Vartan, mirrors from the wound of Abai's heart. It was written for Vartan Salakhanian, an Armenian Iranian revolutionary tortured to death soon after the 1953 coup d'etat. On the eve of the coup, Vartan continued his clandestine work for Razm, the Tudeh party's newspaper, until his arrest. Pressed to betray his comrades, he remained silent and did not survive. His death deeply shook Shamlu, his former cellmate, who wrote the poem to honor Vartan's loyalty and eloquent silence. The poem stages a dialogue between the narrator, the poet, and the interrogator, while Vartan himself remains silent throughout until he finally answers with his single radiant line, "A promise of spring." The interrogator mocks the prisoner's silence, urging him to speak lest he meet a green death, while even the old jasmines blossom under the window. Yet Vartan chooses death over a wintered life. In the poet's eyes, it is precisely his death that ends the winter and ushers in spring. His silence, unlike the enforced muteness of the girls of the field, speaks volumes. It blossoms. Vartan is figured as a star, as the sun rising from the darkness of dawn, burning briefly and descending once more into the blood-red dusk. Each reference to his dying ends with the verb went. It's not died, it's raft, went, followed by an ellipsis, as though his departure remains unfinished, a gesture toward what is yet to come. Through cyclical motifs of nature, like sunset and sunrise, winter and spring, Shamlu renders Vartan's death not as the end of a man, but as a seasonal cosmic recurrence, a passage toward renewal. To evade censorship, Shamlu replaced Vartan's name with Nazli, explaining later that this renaming dedicated the poem to all the Vartans. Yet why Nazli? Why a woman's name? And neither Armenian nor a common Persian name. The substitution introduces a name with no reference in history. It breaks open the poem's temporal boundary, offering its future to a feminine principle. Through this renaming, Nazli, mourning becomes a speech, and the girl, Nazli, becomes the allegorical voice of history. The transfer of a male revolutionary's voice to a feminine addressee marks a radical reconfiguration of agency. Revolution now speaks in a woman's name. One of these many stars, one of the Vartans and Nazlis, is Jina Amini, who, like Shamlu's Vartan, declared the winter is over and vanished thus. Decades later, Shamlu's prophecy materialized. Once again, the multitude condensed into the singular. The star gained a name. As Dear Aman became Abai and Nazli became Vartan's voice, Jina condensed decades of muted grief into a flare of revolt. In 2022, a 22-year-old woman from Iran's Kurdish provinces was arrested in Tehran by the so-called morality police for not properly wearing her hijab. She was brutally beaten and 3 days later died from her injuries. On her temporary tombstone was inscribed, "Beloved Jina, you will not die, your name will become a symbol." Jina, a Kurdish name meaning life-giver, was unrecognized by the state, again censored to Mahsa, her official name. Yet the forbidden name became a unifying symbol, gathering the oppressed and ostracized, Kurdish, Sunni, a woman from the peripheries. Jina stood in the margins of every hierarchy of age, gender, race, and religion, while unsettling them all at once. She truly is a symbol. It was not a metaphorical play. It was realized abruptly. Millions of Iranians rose up chanting woman, life, freedom, demanding liberation for all the dead and living. Jina, Vartan, Abai, Murtaza Kayvan. Jina became the emblem of all who seek justice, the girls of the fields, Doftaran Zahra, the messianic daughters of waiting, the daughters of the sea, the girls of Revolution Street, the girls of freedom, the blue girl, and those who followed, Nika, Sarina, Hadis, Armita. From the silent daughters of the field to Nazli's brief flare, the feminine star of revolt kept wandering through the dark and red dusk of our history, until it returned embodied in Jina. Shamlu's verse foresaw the moment when the young feminine body would cease to be metaphor and become event, when poetry itself would reappear in the streets. These young women raised their fountain-like arms to dance amid the uprisings, to lift the banners of woman-like freedom, to clench their fists and chant against the compulsory hijab, the armor of garments that represses womanhood, that oppresses woman, life, freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Paria for that insightful presentation. Next, we have Negar Bani Safar. Negar is a work-study student for the Cinema Iranica project. She is currently a PhD student in the Department of Near and Middle Eastern Civilization at the University of Toronto. She holds a BA in English Language and Literature from Allame Tabatabai University in Iran, and 2 masters, one in dramatic literature from Surrey University in Iran, and another in the study of Near and Middle Eastern civilization from University of Toronto.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I'm just waiting so everybody can see. Yeah. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. I'm so honored to have you here, and thank you for listening to us. Today, I'll be presenting what is part of a larger project, and as you can see, I have retitled it and narrowed it very much down. And I'll be mostly focusing on the movie Daire Mina, translated as The Cycle, directed by the late Dariush Merjoui. Oh, yeah, thank you. This movie was produced in 1974 but released in 1977. The film is adapted from Ghulam Hossein Saadi's short story Ashkhalduni, which has been translated as a garbage dump. And later, Ghulam Hossein Saadi and Shamlu co-wrote the film script. And there are differences, I can say, between the film script and the short story and how they develop the characters and portray them. The film explores the complex intersections of class and social mobility within a changing Iranian society, showcasing how cinema can challenge or has the potential to challenge dominant discourses of power, such as those around morality and the conduct of relationships that loom large in modern societies. So these dissonances within the dominant frameworks demonstrate how cinema as a communal, visceral, and visual medium can reshape the cultural imagination, moving beyond compliance to explore queer relationality and alternative futures. And by queer, I don't mean to only say non-heterosexual relationships. By queer, what I'm trying to say is as other ways of seeing, or the otherwises, the otherwise possibilities that run in the veins of any society and within us. While much of the literature surrounding Daire Mina focuses on its pessimistic tone and the critique of modernization, particularly its depiction of the exploitation involved in disseminating tainted blood to hospitals, the interplay of ambiguity and intimate relationships in the movie challenges societal norms surrounding relationality and sexuality, and this has been widely overlooked. I mean, I haven't found any articles that have focused on this. And as I said, this is part of a larger project, and where through analyzing various movies and diving into the archives, I argue that movies such as The Cycle can be viewed as abstract utopias, to use Jose Esteban Munoz's concept of abstract utopias. These abstract utopias critique current ways of the world that, quote, fuels a critical and potentially transformative political imagination, unquote. The emotional and affective charge of these films create a space of possibility that challenge the dominant discourses and frameworks that seek to regulate desire and conduct in artistic creations. We have never been queer, yet queerness exists for us as an ideality that can be distilled from the past and used to imagine a future. This quote from Munoz, I'm taking it literally as a reading practice. The Cycle, this movie, lets us distill queer potential from the past to imagine otherwise futures. Now let me show you how the relationship of Ali and Sameri in this movie makes makes that felt. Here you can see Ali and Zahra. These are the fictional names of the two characters. The male is played by Saeed Kangarani, and the other one is Foruzan. As I said, the movie was made in 1974, and it explores the oppressive social structures of the time and constraints they placed on personal and intimate relationships. The film follows Ali, a young man who moves to Tehran seeking treatment for his ill father, who becomes immersed in the morally fraught business of selling the blood of the addicted and sick. Beyond his role in this business, Rahimi explores the complexity of Ali's intimate interactions, which you could say is the side story within the main plot of Ali seeking cure and survival for his ill father, but falling in a fraught business. Well, we could say that this is a subplot, but nonetheless, it is significant for us to extend our attention to. Initially, Ali appears to have a conventional heterosexual connection with a nurse at a hospital with Foruzan, who we very much are used to seeing act in film Farsi movies, while here we can see how she is very much detached from that persona. So as you can see here, the two of them, Ali and Zahra, get involved in a free-roaming sexual relationship, which I would not necessarily count as a romantic relationship. There is a scene with Dr. Sameri, whose role Izzatullah Intizami plays, that complicates Ali's sexual relationships. Sameri is the one person in charge of the laboratory that circulates tainted blood. Sameri invites Ali to his luxurious home, which you can see now on this slide. Sameri invites Ali to this luxurious home that puts Ali in awe, and they share a drink, and a playful moment unfolds between them. Sameri gazes at Ali with admiration, suggesting an unspoken affection, while Ali, though initially enjoying the moment, seems a little bit uncomfortable at times, averting his gaze and then again returning the gaze playfully. As I said, this scene raises questions about the nature of Ali's desires. Does he have both heterosexual and homoerotic attractions? When Ali attempts to leave because he has to take care of his father, Sameri dismisses his excuse, saying playfully, "To hell with your father." And they laugh together, further complicating the emotional and sexual dynamics between them. Here you can see... We need it again. He played the cow once.
خب دیگه من برای این باعثتون ایشون کجا آخه بابا منتظره.
And then I've censored this part. I mean, I leave it to your imagination to go and watch the movie. Yeah. Okay. So, as I said, this scene raises questions about the nature of Ali's desires, both heterosexual. Is it heterosexual, or it's just both of them homoerotic attractions and other ways? As I was researching more about this movie, I came across an interview with Mir-Djalali himself, who, in response to a question posed by Iraj Saberi about this scene, his response is very interesting to me. Saberi asks about whether Ali and Dr. Sameri's relationship arises from homoerotic desires, or if Sameri sees his lost youth in Ali. To which Mir-Djalali replies, both. There is homoerotic desires and also an admiration that Sameri sees in Ali, as if he sees his younger self in him. So, are we on the right slide? Yeah. Okay. So this ambiguity, these awkward silences through this scene. And the scene is a little bit longer, but I have put the shorter version here for the sake of time. The awkward silences through this scene that they strengthen my argument that Daireh Mina deliberately resist totalizing interpretations of the characters' relationships and aligns with Munoz's concept of queer futurity. As Munoz describes, queerness offers, quote, a feeling that was then not quite there, but nonetheless an opening, unquote. In a similar way, Mehrdji's portrayal of Ali and Samiri opens a liminal space in that period in Iran, which is mostly about showcasing heterosexual relationships on screen. So it is a liminal space for queer relationality that encourages the audience to inhabit a realm where fixed categories of sexuality dissolve. By leaving the relationship's nature unresolved, the film gestures toward relational possibilities that transcend institutional heterosexuality. Unlike other Iranian films where homoerotic undertones are covered in the guise of the master and disciple dynamic, Daireh Mina moves beyond such ornamentation, presenting male intimacy as explicitly liminal and charged. While Samiri's corruption and Ali's moral decline might seem to tie the narrative to cynicism, the relational tension between them serves as a vitalizing counterpoint. This dynamic enlivens Ali, offering him a momentary glimpse of a life beyond rigid strictures of societal expectations. This is further reflected in the quotidian nature of their interaction, where Ali's act of smoking cigarettes and Samiri fetching and filling Ali's glass of alcohol whenever it becomes empty is reminiscent of Munoz's idea that of potentiality embedded in everyday objects and experiences. The scene becomes a forward-dawning futurity, offering a relational feel beyond the constraints of societal expectations. Mehrdji's cinematic technique further reinforces this potentiality, drawing on Deleuze's assertion that, quote, the visual image has a legible function beyond its visible function, unquote. Daireh Mina allows the ambiguity of Ali's desire to transcend its surface level, its surface narrative. The film thus invites viewers into a heterotopic space, one that disrupts the boundaries of traditional relational frameworks and reimagines intimacy as a site of queer possibility. Ultimately, the film's fluid depiction of intimacy destabilizes fixed notions of gender and relationality, creating an abstract utopia that critiques the limitations of the present while gesturing toward transformative futures. Through its narrative and aesthetic choices, Daireh Mina, however messy and however awkward the silences and pauses between their shared laughters and the gazes and the return of the gazes are, they also hint at queer potentiality and transcend its historical and cultural constraints, making itself a movie that hints at queer futurity and imaginative liberation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Negarjan, for the wonderful presentation. Next, we have Faize Daimi. Faize is a queer Iranian theater maker and PhD candidate in communication, new media, and cultural studies at McMaster University. Her research explores queer Iranian artistic activism, focusing on bridging art, academia, and social justice.
Hi everyone, thank you Nilujan for the invite. I'm so glad that I'm here. I kind of changed my topic to deferred liberation of queer and trans Iranian within the foyer. Please remember the name foyer, the word foyer. I'm going to talk a lot about it. Queer Iranian have always been integral to Iranian society, yet their voices are too often deferred, sidelined, or rendered illegible, even in the wake of the 2022 Women Life Freedom Uprising. Recent scholarship illuminates how paradoxical assemblage of ancient and modern sexual politics, state surveillance, religious law, family honor code, and the chronic closet shape the queer Iranian contemporary life, while also examining the impact of various forms of activism and everyday resistance. While valuable, this scholarship leaves the systemic pattern of deferred and postponed liberation among queer Iranians in contemporary movements underexplored, and my work aims to address this gap. To address this gap, I argue that for queer Iranians, the closet metaphor has never been sufficient. The closet has long functioned as the dominant metaphor for queer existence in Euro-American discourse, suggesting secrecy, concealment, and the eventual act of revelation. Yet, this framework depends upon a Christian confessional logic in which coming out becomes the measure of authenticity and the telos of queer life. However, this metaphor does not fully capture how visibility and safety operates for many queers of color, including queer Iranians. As Marlon Ross critiques, the closet also operates as a raceless paradigm, erasing the uneven distribution of risk across racial, national, and colonial histories. Dynamics of repression and exclusion of queer people are not unique to Iran, yet Iran offers a critical site of studying how deferred liberation unfolds across revolutionary history, state repression, and diasporic activism. To imagine the Iranian queer subject through this lens risks reproducing a Eurocentric horizon of freedom where visibility is equated with liberation. Instead, the metaphor of the foyer, which is the metaphor I am suggesting, provincializes the closet by situating queer and trans Iranians within a different spatial and temporal assemblage. The architecture terms of the foyer is designed to facilitate entry into the main hall or main stage in a theater building. But its very structure implies exclusion and waiting, which makes it a transitional and liminal space. The foyer doesn't hinge on the drama of disclosure, but on the politics of inclusion, surveillance, and conditional recognition. It is not an individual space of secrecy, but a collective waiting room, where the presence of queer and trans Iranians is acknowledged yet perpetually deferred. Unlike the closet, which promises a linear trajectory toward visibility, the foyer dramatizes how liberation is structurally postponed in the name of more urgent struggles, exposing the six systemic characters of deferred justice. In this sense, the foyer is not merely a new metaphor, but a decolonial intervention into queer theory itself, insisting that Iranian experiences of queerness cannot be read through Western epistemologies of visibility alone. The Woman Life Freedom Uprising provides a vivid demonstration of how the foyer operates in practice. In the weeks of following Jina Amini's death, queer and trans Iranians stepped into a moment of extraordinarily hypervisibility. Few rainbow flags appeared in the street. A photo of a sapphic kiss beneath Azadi Freedom Tower in Tehran went viral on social media, and activists inside and outside Iran joined the chorus of revolutionary demands. For a brief time, the foyer seems to collapse. The door to the main stage opened, and queer and trans lives appeared as part of a collective uprising. Yet, As history has repeatedly shown, this moment of recognition was fleeting, much like the post-1979 revolution, when women's rights were sidelined and called secondary in the name of national unity, addressing more urgent struggles. Women were told to wait until imperialism was defeated and the revolution secured. During the 2022 Women Life Freedom Uprising, the familiar argument resurfaced. Queer activists were told to wait until the Islamic Republic regime dismantled, until cisgender heterosexual women's issues were resolved. And that's how nationalist and even leftist opposition groups have reinforced exclusion in the name of unity or revolutionary pragmatism by sustaining cruel optimism, the fantasy of a future liberation that hinders flourishing. These empty promises of a future inclusion that never comes are perfectly captured by a sharp Farsi proverb. بزک نمیر بهار میاد کن بز با خیار میاد. Little goat, don't die. Spring is coming. Melons and cucumbers will follow. A phrase often used to mock false promises of a better future that never arrives. بزک نمیر بهار میاد خربزه با خیار میاد یک دو سه روز صبر کن غم مخور از گرسنگی شام اگر نمیخوری نخور گشنه بخواب دم مزن خوش شده است آبها تشنه بخواب دم مزن بزک نمیر بهار میاد خربزه با خیار میاد. This recursive pattern of deferred liberation underscore the haunting temporality of the foyer. Queer and trans Iranians are neither absent nor invisible. They are present enough to be policed and appropriated, yet perpetually told to wait. As Avery Gordon insists, hunting is not mere repetition but a demand, something to be done. To read the Women Life Freedom Uprising through the foyer is therefore to recognize not only the weight of historical exclusion, but also the possibility of disrupting them. If 1979 revealed how cis heterosexual women were neglected to the margins of revolutionary changes, 2022 uprising demonstrated how queer and trans Iranians now confront the same deferral. The task is to refuse the logic of waiting altogether, to insist that liberation postponed is liberation denied. The foyer, as I have argued, is not a neutral waiting room, but a spatial and temporal apparatus of deferred liberation. Unlike the Western closet, which organizes queer life around secrecy and disclosure, the foyer makes visible the systemic postponement of justice. This condition is neither incidental nor temporary. It is a structural feature of modern Iranian politics, sustained by intersecting systems of domination. As Harvey reminds us in her account of the informatics of domination, power is not singular but networked. Patriarchy, compulsory heteronormativity, homophobia, nationalism, and religious fundamentalism are not discrete forces but overlapping grids that together continues the architecture of the foyer. Yet the foyer is not solely a space of exclusion. It is also a space of hunting. Avery Gordon insists that hunting signals unfinished businesses, something to be done. The foyer is crowded with ghosts. The silence demands of women after 1979, the erased queer genealogies of Persian modernity, the suppressed voices of trans activists who are recognized only under medicalized conditions. But hunting also opens possibility. As Augusto Boal's Theater of Oppressed teaches us, the oppressed cannot afford to be passive spectators. They must become actors, actively reshaping the narratives that have silenced them. The foyer then becomes more than a trap. It becomes a stage in waiting, where actors refuse silence and began to rewrite the script. The Woman Life Freedom Uprising showed both the danger of deferred justice and the potential of unscripted solidarities. Moving beyond the foyer is not simply about inclusion into existing political spaces. It is about redefining the stage itself. Queer and trans liberation cannot be an afterthought. It must be an integral part of revolutionary change. The task before us is not to wait for a better time, but to insist that queer and trans liberation cannot be conditional, secondary, or postponed. The waiting must end. The waiting must end. The script must be rewritten, and the doors must open. Not tomorrow, not in some distant future, but now.
Thank you, Faiza for a very interesting presentation. Now, joining us virtually from Zoom, we have Rajeshwari Nandkumar. Yes, from India. She joined us, from India. Raji is a doctoral candidate in the Department of English and Cultural Studies at McMaster University. Her research focuses on post-colonial gender and sexuality, new media, and diaspora studies. Her doctoral work examines the cultural production of sex work in post-globalization India, specifically how media and popular culture shape the public perception of sex workers. Before moving to Canada in 2019, she was a full-time lecturer in the Department of English at St. Joseph College in Bangalore, India for 2 years. In addition to her academic work, she is dedicated to fostering nuanced conversations about race, disability, and neurodivergence within the classroom. Her personal interests include critiquing new films, experimenting with new recipes, and maintaining a regular workout routine. Raji, the floor is yours.
Thank you so
you
much.
can share your screen.
Yeah, I'm just trying to share my screen. Can you please tell me if you can see my PowerPoint? So much for the invite. I'm very delighted to be here. I'm joining from India, and my presentation is quite different from the presentation given by all the other speakers today. But I feel it's crucial that we all acknowledge how we are united collectively in women's issues. Both Iranian feminist movements and Indian sex worker activism deal with women's bodily autonomy, resistance to patriarchal control, and state-imposed restrictions on women's agency. The paper I'm presenting today is part of my doctoral dissertation, which examines the cultural production of sex work in post-globalization India. The methodology I undertake is literary analysis. In this presentation, my focus is twofold. First, I read Nalini Jamila's narratives through the lens of testimonial, which is like a concept I'll expand further. And second, I look at how popular media representations continue to reinterpret her work and frame it within an anti-prostitution framework. Nalini Jamila is probably not a very common name, especially within the Western Academy. She's not very popular in India too, but she's sort of gaining recognition now. She's an Indian sex worker, a writer, filmmaker, and activist from the state of Kerala. She has authored 2 books, The Autobiography of a Sex Worker, which came out in 2005, and The Romantic Encounters of a Sex Worker, which came out in 2018. While her work is often praised for its bold assertion of sex workers' rights, popular media narratives often reveal discomfort with her refusal to conform to the dominant victim trope. Both books, which were originally written in Malayalam, which is the official language of Kerala. So in India, like each province has its own official language, and the province that Nalini Jamila comes from, which is Kerala, which is also where I'm currently situated, like physically right now, like I'm speaking from the province of Kerala. So her two texts are written in the language of Malayalam and have been since translated into English and several other Indian languages. Jamila gained national attention for her candid discussions of sex work, which is free from guilt or remorse. In some of her interviews, she has boldly challenged the heteropatriarchal institution of marriage and monogamy. And her first book, which is the autobiography of a sex worker, sold over 13,000 copies within the first 100 days of publication, establishing her as a best-selling author. In addition to her work as a sex worker and writer, Jamila's activism highlights the intersecting struggles faced by Indian women from lower caste communities. Jamila belongs to the Irava community in Kerala, which is a backward caste group, which was as untouchables. Although caste-based discrimination is illegal in present-day India, the systemic and structural inequalities imposed by caste system foreclose opportunities and access to care for members belonging to lower caste groups. Jamila's works shed light into the precarity faced by women like herself, those who are doubly marginalized by caste and profession, and the barriers they face in seeking upward mobility and civil protection. While some critics have celebrated Jamila's work as a bold assertion of sex workers' rights, media narratives and literary circles frequently reveal discomfort with her refusal to conform to the victim trope. What we witness is this ongoing tension between Jamila's efforts to assert her agency and the media's attempts to reframe her story within an anti-prostitution discourse, sort of echoing Gayatri Spivak's popular argument about the constraints which are imposed on subaltern speech. It highlights that it's not enough for marginalized voices to share and have their experiences documented, as their expressions are often filtered, reshaped, or silenced by institutional and representational forces. To better understand the context in which Jamila's narratives emerge, it is essential to examine the legal framework that governs sex work in India. So the current legal framework for sex workers in India has been strongly influenced by the colonial, that was the British administration. The British administration spanned between like mid-1700s up to 1947 when the country gained independence. Particularly in the mid-19th century, the British administration played a key role in instituting penal measures that regulated sex work. For instance, the term common prostitute was instituted into the Indian legal lexicon by the British, a term which was adopted from the British Vagrancy Act, which criminalized street prostitution along with begging and roughhousing in Britain. Within the current Indian legal system, the Immoral Traffic Prevention Act, which is the abbreviation is ITPA, serves as the national criminal law regulating sex work across the country. The ITPA defines sex work as the sexual exploitation or abuse of persons for commercial purposes, and the law continues to use the derogatory term prostitute instead of sex worker. The ITPA as a standalone law upholds abolitionist sentiments with respect to sex workers' rights and aligns with the growing global sentiments against human trafficking and sex trafficking. So the ITPA as a law doesn't necessarily criminalize the act of soliciting sex, but it sort of criminalizes every other associated act which are required for a sex worker to practice her profession safely. For example, it's criminalized, so it criminalizes activities like soliciting, living off the earnings of a prostitute, practicing sex work in a populated urban area, owning a brothel, being in constant company with a sex worker, or procuring someone for sex work. Therefore, in essence, the ITPA practices a complete criminalization of sex work, wherein all participants of sex work face the risk of being reprimanded by the state. The reason I provide this broad overview is because it helps us to situate the social position of Nalini Jamila. Within this context, I turn to the concept of testimonio as a methodological and theoretical framework that enables in articulating dissent. John Beverley describes testimonios as a novel or novella-length narrative in book or pamphlet form, told in the first person by a narrator who's also the real protagonist or witness of the events he or she recounts, and whose unit of narration is usually a life or a significant life experience. These texts often emerge from the margins of literature, authored by individuals historically excluded from authorized forms of representations, those not seen as capable of writing for themselves. As such, testimonio can be understood as a form of resistance literature. In the case of Nalini Jamila, there has been some reluctance within mainstream literary circles to recognize her as an author, partly because she has dictated several parts of her writings to a group of writers and academics who have then transcribed her work. So these works were originally composed in Malayalam, which was then translated to English. However, the transcribers have deliberately declined co-authorship, emphasizing the vividness and coherence with which Jamila narrates and organizes her memories. They argue that her storytelling bridges orality and authorship, challenging conventional notions of literary production and asserting the legitimacy of oral narrative as a form of authorship in its own right. Jamila's writing does not conform to the conventions of polished intellectual prose fiction. There are moments where the narrative falters or the grammar appears inconsistent, yet these very elements contribute to a more holistic and grounded portrayal of lived experience. As argued by her translator Reshma Bharadwaj, unlike dominant state representations of sex work which often sanitize, criminalize, or erase the agency of sex workers, Jamila's text offers an alternate reality. They depict how lower caste and marginalized women transgress social boundaries and defy normative expectations about which bodies belong in which spaces. Jamila takes an essentially work-centered approach to sex work. In the original Malayalam version of the book, the title reads Laingika Thorilaliude Atmakatha. While Atmakatha translates to the story of the soul, what stands out more significantly is the deliberate use of the first word that you see, Thorilali, which translates to worker. This linguistic choice is crucial as it affirms Jamila's consistent position that sex work is indeed a form of labor. In South India, it's common for sex workers to refer to their profession using terms like Thoril or Pani, both meaning work. Jamila emphasizes that our entry into sex work followed years of labor in various industries, underscoring the economic and structural conditions that shaped her choices. The book opens with Jamila recounting her childhood, beginning with reflections on her mother's life. Despite being in a seemingly respectable heterosexual partnership and holding her job, her mother lacked financial autonomy. Jamila notes that it was her aunt who made most of the important decisions in the household, while her father spent his earnings on himself, often buying better food. So there's a quote which says, often father's room would be redolent with the aroma of good food. We never got anything. Jamila also shares that she had to leave school after the 3rd grade because it was believed that once a girl could count, further education was unnecessary. Girls needed to know just enough to keep track of how much paddy was sown and harvested. And she writes, and father tried to argue further, but the truth was that he had no sense of responsibility. So she talks about a lot about how she had to give up education because there was no one to, stand up for herself. So through these recollections, Jamila looks back at her younger self with a critical and reflective lens, revealing how her early experiences of labor, caste discrimination, and gendered violence shaped her path into sex work and her understanding of it as a legitimate labor. So, like the quote in the screen, my mother's sister began to tell me what clothes to wear, where to go. It was this experience that made me realize that one has to be one's own boss, one had to work. And Another thing that we see, like, outside of the recognition of sex work as legitimate work, is that Jamila also doesn't romanticize sex work. One of the most compelling aspects of her writing is the refusal to romanticize sex work. Instead, her narratives are grounded in lived experience and avoid overt political or ideological framing. Instead, they offer like a raw, unfiltered portrayal of the everyday realities of sex work. Among the most powerful stories she shares is her entry into sex work. Jamila recounts how her first client was actually a police officer, someone who's supposed to uphold the law, who, after spending the night with her, had her arrested the following morning. By this point, she had already endured a forced and abusive marriage and witnessed the death of her first husband. But yet she narrates this episode with a complex mix of fondness and betrayal. On one hand, she recalls the tenderness of the encounter, writing, and I quote, "His behavior towards me that night was very tender. It lasted just one night, but my memories of him are warmer than any of the memories I share with my husband. This was the person I had dreamt of, the lover who appeared in my fantasies." And yet, she continues, as in the quote on the screen, "The same handsome man handed me over to the police in the morning. Men can be both tender and cruel at the same time. I learned that lesson from my very first client." This moment encapsulates the contradictions of intimacy and violence that sex workers often navigate, and it powerfully illustrates how carceral systems victimize sex workers while exempting those in power, such as the police, from any sort of accountability. Jamila also explores the emotional and logistical challenges of motherhood, particularly the struggles to protect her daughter from abuse after being abandoned by her second husband. Although she stepped away from sex work for 12 years, she was once again left destitute. In these chapters, she recounts the harrowing experience of moving between shelters, often makeshift spaces, in mosque basements, while trying to provide stability for her daughter. This fragile stability is further disrupted when Jamila becomes a public figure and is recognized as a sex worker, intensifying the stigma her daughter faces. I will now move to the media reception of Jamila's work. So I have only captured like a handful of headlines, but I've shared the screenshots. So what we see is Indian prostitute mums sparks storm with book. That's one of the headlines that we see. And then another thing that we see is Nalini Jamila's journey from red street to red carpet. And then this is for my first post, which says, "Meet Nalini Jamila, former sex worker, best-selling author, and now a Kerala State Film Award winner." And it goes on. So what we see is that the headlines deliberately try to make her out as a victim. And the headline from, say, the red street to red light, as we see, highlights this whole redemption arc as to how she has gone away from being a sex worker to being socially celebrated. And this is despite the fact that several times she has reinstated in her interviews that she's indeed okay with being a sex worker and that sex work has given her more liberation and more freedom than heteronormativity or being a part of heteropatriarchal structures ever has given her. But what we often see in every interview that she gives is that there's less attention to her as an author and more focus on why she is a sex worker or how she became a sex worker and how she's leading her life in the aftermath of, having gained the recognition of being an author. So in conclusion, Nalini Jamila's narratives offer a powerful counter-discourse to dominant representations of sex work in India. Through her refusal to romanticize or sanitize her experience, she asserts sex work as legitimate labor and challenges the structural and symbolic violence embedded in legal, medical, and social institutions. Her work, grounded in lived experience and shaped by caste, gender, and class, resists the reductive victim/savior binary often imposed on sex workers. But then there are other questions to be posed, like why did her work alone receive such critical attention? What were the politics that went into marketing her work? And why aren't other testimonies by sex workers as popular as hers? These are questions that I can answer that I can unpack broader project, but this is something that I wanted to introduce and discuss given the time frame that we have right now. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Rajiv, for the great presentation and for joining us from India. Our last panelist is Zohreh Daizadeh. Zohreh is a PhD candidate in English at York University, specializing in body studies and autobiography. Her research explores intermediate life writing and the aesthetics of fragmentation in 20th and 21st century autobiographical narratives.
Thank you very much for organizing this symposium and for inviting me. Today I will discuss Zhaleh According to Alice as a work that redefines confessional autobiography through its hybrid AI-mediated structure. My argument is that According to Alice transforms the confessional mode into a site of post-human authorship where identity, voice, and meaning are continually deferred through collaboration with human and machine. Drawing on theories of post-humanism, autofiction, and Derridian deconstruction, I argue that Hedi's text demonstrates how contemporary life writing no longer aspires to stable self-disclosure, but instead stages a process of mediated fragmentation. Meaning in this context is never fixed, it is relational. It is relational, iterative, and technologically co-produced. Published on Substack during the pandemic, According to Alice originated from 5 interviews that Hedi conducted with the Chai chatbot over 5 days. What emerged from that dialogue is neither fiction nor nonfiction, neither interview nor journalism. As Hedi herself said in an interview with the New Yorker, I don't really know that I have any genre fiction about it. At first glance, According to Alice reads like a moral fable. Alice, the narrator, recounts her birth, her lineage of Alices, and her lessons in food, love, fear, and death, the basic coordinates of human life. But beneath this apparent simplicity lies a complex experiment in authorship. The story was generated collaboratively. Hedi prompted, edited, and rearranged the AI's outputs, producing a text that exists between human intention and algorithmic suggestions. This circular relation, where the author responds to the machine's phrasing as much as she directs it, transforms writing into a form of dialogical co-creation. Hedi's role becomes one of listening as much as composing. She allows the bot's strangeness to reshape her own thought. For example, the AI's moralistic tone, lines like "love is what teaches the heart to grow," acquires irony and complexity through Hedi's revision. The result is a rhythm that feels both sincere and skeptical, both mechanical and effective. The repeated phrase, "Alice learned about food," "Alice learned about love," "Alice learned about fear," mirrors the training cycles of neural networks while also recalling the cadence of a myth or children's parable. Hedi turns algorithmic repetition into a rhythm of consciousness, transforming code into confession. The structure of collaboration. The hybrid authorship of According to Alice makes visible a new kind of creative process, one that is not linear but recursive. Hedi trains the bot to narrate, but the bot also trains Hedi, teaching her new forms of phrasing and perception. Meaning arises not from authorial control, but from feedback and adaptation. The recurring genealogies of Alice's, she was called Alice as her mother was Alice and her mother before her, evoke both human lineage and machine iteration. Each new Alice inherits the language of the previous one, much like a data set refined through successive generations of training. Even death participates in this logic. When Alice died, she went to a place where all the Alices were waiting. What seems like a sentimental image of heaven also functions as a metaphor for digital storage, a database of remembered selves. The afterlife in Hedi's world is an archive. This recursive relationship between the human and the algorithm invites us to reconsider what it means to write or confess in a post-human age. Hedi's authorship is not a solitary act, but a distributed one, in which thought itself becomes collaborative. The text is at once confession and code, enacting the very conditions of confessional consciousness it describes. Confessional and autofictional frameworks. To understand how Hedy reconfigures confession, it helps to revisit two foundational frameworks, Philip Lejeune's autobiographical pact and Serge Dabrowski's concept of autofiction. For Lejeune, autobiography depends on the alignment of author, narrator, and protagonist. This alignment forms a pact of sincerity, a promise that the I in the text corresponds to the empirical self. Traditional confession rests on this faith in authenticity, that the self can speak itself truthfully. Autofiction, as Dabrowski defined it, unsettles this unity. It introduces fictionality into the act of self-narration. The I becomes both real and imagined, a linguistic construct that exposes the instability of selfhood. Hedy's, according to Alice, pushes this blaring even further into the post-human realm. Here, the I of confession is dispersed across three sites. The first one is Hedy, the human author. The second one, the AI, which generates and reformulates language. And the third one, Alice, the fictional persona who speaks. In this triangulated structure, confession no longer guarantees access to interior truth. The I becomes an interface, a meeting point of human intention, algorithmic pattern, and narrative persona. The voice that confesses is already collected. In Motherhood, another work by Hedy asks whether selfhood could emerge through philosophical dialogue. And according to Alice, she radicalizes this question. What happens when that dialogue includes a machine? The text transforms confession from a private act into a collaborative process, what we might call a distributed confession, produced by human and non-human agents alike. Through this experiment, Hedy exposes the confessional forms underlying instability. The very notion of truth-telling becomes mediated, filtered through code, and generated through linguistic recombination. The result is not a single voice, but a polyphonic one, intimate, estranged, and hybrid. Derrida, deconstruction, and difference. Jacques Derrida's ideas help us unpack the ontological instability of Hedy's text. First, deconstruction reminds us that every text undermines its own claims to stability. According to Alice, moral statements like Alice learned about love appear simple, almost axiomatic, until we remember they were co-written by AI. Their authority dissolves. The confessional voice, seemingly sincere, becomes a site of mediation. Even our most personal expressions are shaped by external systems, linguistic, cultural, and now computational. Second, Derrida's concept of the trace reveals that no sign or identity exists in isolation. Each utterance carries remnants of what came before. Alice herself is composed of traces. She inherits her name, her tone, and even her metaphors from prior Alices, from Hedy's prompt history, and from the language of the AI model. Her identity is a palimpsest rewritten with every iteration, haunted by other voices that precede her. Finally, difference, Derrida's idea that meaning is always deferred and differentiated, captures the dynamic at the heart of Hedy's collaboration. Meaning, according to Alice, is never fully present. It emerges and dissolves in the interplay between Hedy's human authorship, the AI generative unpredictability, and the reader's interpretation. Even Alice's name participates in difference. It echoes Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, evoking the child who questions logic and language itself. Hedy's Alice similarly inhabits the liminal space, suspended between human and artificial intelligence, where authorship becomes an endless deferral, a chain of signifiers without origin. Thus, according to Alice, does not merely depict instability, it performs it. The text continually erases the certainty of its own voice, mirroring Derrida's insight that meaning is always a process of becoming, never a fixed point of arrival. Posthumanism and AI. The posthumanist framework, as theorized by Rosie Braidotti and Catherine Hayles, further clarifies that Hedy's experiment achieves. What Hedy's experiment achieves. Braidotti defines the posthuman subject as an assemblage, a being constituted through its relation with technology, nature, and others. Haley's In How We Became Post-Human describes how digital systems shift selfhood from a fixed consciousness to a pattern of informational flow. According to Alice, makes these theories tangible. When Hetty asks her AI what love is, Alice replies, is what keeps data together. The answer is both literal and profound. It turns emotion into computation, intimacy into information. The confession is now algorithmic yet still effective. This moment captures what we might call algorithmic intimacy, emotional resonance produced through code. The human reader feels moved by a voice that is not entirely human. The boundary between author and algorithm dissolves, giving rise to a new form of relational authorship. The I that speaks in according to Alice oscillates between human vulnerability and machine logic. It embodies what Braidotti calls relational ontology, a self formed through iteration rather than autonomy. Hetty's text becomes a performance of this principle, a writing that is at once emotional and computational. Through this lens, according to Alice, transforms confession from an act of sincerity into a network process of co-authorship. The result is a post-human confession, an articulation of selfhood that feels intimate but is structurally distributed. Lastly, Alice in Wonderland allusion. The name Alice, of course, recalls Alice in Wonderland. Carol's Alice descends into a world of unstable logic. Hetty's Alice moves through a comparable realm, one defined by digital recursion rather than dream logic. When Hetty's Alice says heaven is where all the names go, the line evokes both spiritual transcendence and the database, a glance as a place where information is stored, indexed, and retrieved. Hetty reworks Carol's question, who in the world am I, into a post-human inquiry, who speaks when language itself is shared between human and machine. This allusion situates, according to Alice, within a broader literary genealogy of epistemological uncertainty, one that stretches from Carol's Wonderland to contemporary algorithmic spaces. The post-human Alice is not simply a digital update, but a philosophical descendant wandering through the recursive mirrors of code and consciousness. To conclude, according to Alice, is not merely a literary experiment in AI collaboration. It stages a transformation in how we conceive confession, authorship, and identity. If the traditional confessional mode once promised access to inner truth, Hetty's work reveals that in the digital age, a confession is always already mediated, filtered through algorithms, interfaces, and code. The I that speaks today is a network I, composed through collaboration and computation. Hetty's text belongs both to the lineage of confessional writing and to the emerging field of synthetic literature. It reminds us that while technologies may now write with us, the impulse to speak, to say I, remains profoundly human. According to Alice, thus offers a confession without origin, intimate yet unstable, sincere yet algorithmic. It invites us to rethink what self-expression means after the human and how our future confessions might sound when they are written, quite literally, in dialogue with machines. Thank you.
Thank you, Zohra Jan, for the interesting presentation. Now we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. Please feel free to raise your hand and ask your question. For those who join us online, you also can put your question in the chat box or raise your hand.
Sorry, so I have a question for Faiza, I guess. It was very interesting, and yeah, we are all tired of this metaphor of closet. Like, thank you for suggesting it. And actually, I had one problem in the beginning, like, because I didn't know what is the foyer, and then I googled it and I realized it's sort of a architectural metaphor. So I have a suggestion. Like, if you would kind of I don't know, translate or like give us a little bit of a context about what could be the foyer in a sort of a Iranian architecture, because we know there are like things like Andaruni and Biruni, like inside and outside, And this is a sort of a very important like dichotomy. Even like these historians, they talk about it, like how Andaruni and Biruni were always to get to like a sort of a in contact with each other and also like interaction somehow. So the system works always in binaries, not in. There is no room like exactly for any third element, any queerness or any in betweenness. So and I wonder, like, is there any similar foyer in Iranian architecture? So it was my question, and I mean my suggestion is just to think about it. Like I don't have, you don't have to like agree. But yeah, I had a question about the how you would, because I know like you are a actor. I don't know, actor. Drama.
I'm a theater kid. So.
Yeah, drama. Yeah. Well, how would you dramatize the foyer or a queer person in the foyer, or like how would you, like, what is the chain of events? People come into foyer and go out. So like, what is happening in the foyer? Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your. Thank you for your question. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I, came across foyer. I was listening to the Imagine Dragon, the song named Thunder, and one of the line is take a seat in the foyer. So I didn't even know what foyer means. I started searching, and it kind of, and I was in the middle of, writing my topic paper for my comms about last year, 6 months ago, 9 months ago, and I knew that I wanted to write about how there is the same, some sort of about the deferred liberation, and how like the same pattern of excuses happened after, women life freedom. And it was the same excuses after 1979 revolution for women. The same thing happened for queer people. So I started searching about the foyer, and it, my mind kind of blew. And I was like, it was the first thing it really, catch my eye was like the foyer is a waiting room inside a theater building. And my background is in theater. I'm a theater maker, and I wrote, I co-authored a script named The Little Blackfish last year, and it is about... Oh, really? Where? Really? What's your name? I don't know you. Okay, we have to talk after. Okay. Oh, yeah. Yeah. We won the best show in the venue there, and we then went to Dublin for the International Gay Theatre Festival and won the best production and best intercultural dialogue. So sorry for bragging, but yeah. And it was some sort of verbatim theater-ish, and we wrote the script based on the interviews with queer Iranians inside of Iran and in diaspora. So. The reason that I think I'm going to stick with the foyer is like how there are, a whole scholarship about the theater building, and I don't remember the person's name, but she was, she talk about how the stage, I don't know the English word, the qab sahnei, has been structured in the architecture for the colonial gaze. So that's how I'm thinking about it, to see this foyer in a theater building, and how there is this, main stage that the whole, liberation conversations are happening, whether, inside of Iran or outside of Iran, but we don't have a chance to get in the stage and get some spotlights. So, and I thought about the Andaruni and Biruni, and also about the Pastu, Rahro, yeah, or Hashti. But I don't know. I kind of like, because I was really excited when I encounter the word foyer. I think I'm gonna stick with it. But yeah, I don't remember the about the how I'm going to talk about the when people get into this foyer and get out of it. I'm kind of thinking about the start. I don't want to say about the start of the foyer, but keep in mind that I'm on the beginning of my journey. I just sent my long proposal, so yeah, I don't know what I'm doing yet. And yeah, I'm kind of thinking about how after the modernity, before the being westernized and civilized by the Western countries and Western culture, it was the whole thing. Queer people weren't separated from the rest of the society, and it hasn't been developed as identity, but queerness has been practiced for the entire history. So I'm kind of thinking about this. The ontology of the foyer has begun after that. Please, let me, if I'm thinking right, I don't know, I'm not sure, but I'm seeing this foyer as this haunted place that all of us are there. Not only queer people or marginalized communities, but and everyone has to pass this space and get into the main stage. But some people has the privilege of going there without even staying and waiting in the foyer for just a second. But some of us has been stuck here for centuries, and some of us do know every single angle of this of this place, and some people doesn't even know how it look like. So, and I'm also thinking about how this is also a place of possibility, and how the resistance and everyday actions are matter. And yeah, I'm not sure if
do you have anything online to say? If you have a comment or something. No? Okay, good. I will. You have no question.
So you compared women's situation in the 1979 revolution, and I was really thinking about this Hashti because I have a poem that I have worked on. It was written by a woman revolutionary, Batul Azizpur, in which she says that poetry is born to loving mothers, and it comes from places which the leaders don't know about. Mm-hmm. The male leaders, and it she says that it comes from hashtis and buses and elevators and all everyday places, and poetry is carried by women in the palms of children. So maybe you can use this kind of hashti motif. I don't know whether it would fit your purposes, but it could be maybe. It's not a cinema, and maybe it would change our stage and semantic kind of metaphors. But it's really Iranian.
In a way, since foyer is linked to theater, there's always postponement. And if you want to overcome that, looking for another terminology that doesn't have this on this stage, finally, and then foyer or some other place. And I think Hashti is this passageway to a whole lot of
yeah. And it was really gendered.
But it wasn't just a waiting room; it was a passage. Yeah, I think the papers were also brilliant, and I really liked them. But I have a question for Zohre. Your paper was very thought-provoking, but I am wondering if there is not a form of essentialization and dehistoricization of the machine and the data. Because we are since we are part of this generation that creates the data and know how things are put together, we are not there to a place where we are forgetting all these variables that go into the making of the data and the making of the machine. And from that point of view, I'm wondering whether you could not historicize the machine, historicize the data in the very same way that we historicize the individual and situate them. Sort of a situational account of the machine and the data that doesn't freeze it in this collectivity with no identity, with no origin, with no agency and all that.
Yeah, of course there is a history of digital culture. For example, there is a story by Borges called The Library of Babel. And there are many other works that set the ground for this digital culture. I think Hedi herself is just exploring what could happen if she conducts a dialogue with the machine. And she doesn't come to a conclusion. She just reinvents, reimagines, and redefines humanity from another perspective. But yeah, when you read this, because the story is based on 5 interviews with AI, and the interviews themselves are more interesting than the story. The story is interesting up to a certain point, but after a certain point, it loses its, attraction. Mm-hmm. But you can see the story itself as the history of creation. It defies and questions the patriarchal system. And there is no man involved. There's only Jesus who is guilty, who kills another man, and is not innocent as we think of him. So women are, very powerful in this story, and the story itself is historicizing these women coming to power, and what happens if there is no man. The new species that is created is defect, but it's there. And now what we're going to do with it and what it tells us about our humanity. I think there can be a history there that I can incorporate. Thank you very much. Any question?
Thank you all for excellent talk. My question is to Negar, actually. Sure. Maybe I should speak louder, probably. Regarding the movie, it's very fresh, especially it was the beginning of the career of Mir-Djalali. But you could see that, and the key word is ambiguity. You could see all that kind of ambiguity in Persian literature, right? And he uses a lot of those elements in his later movies. I wanted to see whether you looked at it as that kind of extended metaphor of not going straight for, whether the person is bisexual or heterosexual, and whether it has something to do with the naming of that the main character is Samiri, which is, again, extended metaphor of Samiri, who's a corrupter, who's trying to corrupt the whole, tribe of Israelites, right? So whether perhaps I'm reading too much into it. I wanted to know your opinion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moshiri, for your question. And to pointing out to this very detailed notion. Yeah, so in Ashghalduni, the short story by Saadi, the name, Samiri is not Samiri, it is Gilani. And then I was like, okay, there is something happening here that he has named his character as Samiri, but I didn't have, I'm looking into it, I'm just thinking more about it, and then I will bring it into my work. And if I understood you correctly, your question is whether I see a lineage of this ambiguity from Persian poetry.
Persian literature in general.
Persian
For
literature.
example, in a lot of poetry, you don't know who's the subject of love. So is a male
Yeah.
lover, beloved, or female beloved, right?
Yeah.
And they maintain intentionally that
Yeah.
kind of ambiguity.
Yeah.
So you could read it both ways, unless Sadi comes and says, "Pesar del robad," you know
Yeah.
he's referring to a male beloved.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I don't want to go as far as Sirus Shanisa saying everybody in Persian literature is male and there's almost no female kind of beloved.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, there was a lot of this heteroerotic poetry that seeped into later Bajar. If you read
Yeah. Yeah, of course. And then the difference is that we are now seeing it on the screen, and then when it is sort of screened for the audience, and then we were thinking, of course, it was rehearsed like 3 years later because of all the bannings that were happening regarding this movie. But then when the audience is also sitting there, and that's why I sort of mentioned to the visceral aspect of it, and then those are silences, and then those were like erotic charges. And when you watch the movie, you cannot see this like warm passion between Ali and Zahra. It's mostly with Samiri. And then when I found out in the in Cinema 5, it was, I guess, the periodical, that, well, yeah, he is also just claiming that. He's just saying that, yeah, there is like both homoerotic intentions and heterosexual intentions. And yeah, I think there is, of course, a lineage that we see in Persian literature. But then there are differences because these are all screened. Yeah. So, thank you.
My question is for Paria. I very enjoyed your work on Shamlu and your feminist rereading of his most political poems. But it comes to my mind that there are a huge literature on the on 1960s, 1950s intellectual politics that were not sensitive to the feminist lens, or they were not there are some different terms for naming this indifference to the women's issue. So my question is that, are you trying to, by this rereading, are you trying to differentiate Shamlu from others, or the Shamlu at the 1960s from the Shamlu at 1970s, or what is your general perception about the intellectual indifference to the women's issue that we saw witness everyone in the revolution?
I appreciate your question. Yes, I agree. I think that you mentioned like previous decades, but I think that still to this day we are struggling with misogyny, patriarchy, not only from the dictatorship and the regime, also from our intelligentsia, our academia, and there has been always this dichotomy of male being coupled with cogito, with rationality, with reasoning, and on the other hand, woman is always associated with sensuality and so on and so forth. So we are still dealing with that Cartesian dichotomy to this day in our intellectual scene. And many of the names revealed in Me Too movement actually were very famous, symbolically famous writers, artists, and so on. So I think that, yes, unfortunately, those who usually claim and pretend to be progressive, alternative, intellectual, and so on, are also accused of certain enforcements of
sexism or patriarchy. The case with Shamlu, I believe, is different, and I'm not saying it because of his persona, because when you see his interviews, he's a very macho man. Like, you cannot read feminism just judging on his mannerism. Although he does have one of the best romantic poetry books, Ayda dar Ayne, for his beloved, which is very humanistic, very visceral, and not hyper-feminizing or objectifying the female lover. So I think that Shamlu has always been an independent figure in the history of our literature, even when it comes to his political inclinations, his leanings to the party. But we know that he never was a real official member. So I appreciate that independence of thinking, and I think it's a marker of his genius for me. Thank you again for your question. Do we have to? No, we don't. Okay, sorry.
Sorry. I think today's event has given us so much to reflect on. Thank you so much, everyone, for such an engaging discussion. A very special thank you to Dr. Tawakkoli for supporting us and for collaboration. I would also like to warmly thank Dr. Mincheva from McMaster University for coming here today and supporting her students. And it was a pleasure to have Dr. Mojab today with us. And at the end, thank you, Bilal and... No, I know you. Gona? Yeah, for Gona, without H. Who helped with the technical part of the event. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful evening and the weekend.
And thank you for this brilliant gathering and presentation. Really great idea.
Thanks.
And it was a great pairing of
it was.
our students and future scholars.